This bill will legislate an objective to superannuation, and that will serve for years, decades to come as a guide to policymakers, to governments, now and in the future, to regulators, to industry and the wider community. A legislated objective, a new law, a legal objective for superannuation would be, and I quote, to preserve savings to deliver income for a dignified retirement alongside government support in an equitable and sustainable way. Now, of course, Deputy Speaker, there's many other positive, beneficial outcomes from Australia's world-leading superannuation system, now a multi-trillion-dollar pool of capital, fiscal sustainability for the country in coming decades, reduced costs of international borrowings and so on. But the legislation before the Parliament, if passed, will make clear to governments now and in the future that the primary objective, a shared goal, the fundamental point of superannuation is to provide for a dignified retirement, not to allow future lazy Liberal governments to avoid their own responsibilities and force people to raid their superannuation to get by, to cover up failures in future Liberal governments. Now, it is strange on reflection that the legislation has never had this kind of objective. Doing it now will improve transparency and accountability in the system, and it will provide stability and confidence in the future. Members and funds will have more certainty over future changes through both the accumulation and the retirement phases. The fact is, in Australia now, superannuation, your super, is part of your pay. Not just for the elite either. Decades ago, Deputy Speaker, only the lucky few had superannuation, had a dignified retirement. Ordinary working Australians, millions of ordinary working Australians, basically fell into something approaching poverty in their retirement because there was no method, no means, no requirement to save for a dignified retirement. It was only the higher end of corporate Australia, the upper echelons of the public service, the military and so on that had that option, that benefit. Everyone else was condemned from when they retired until they died to the age pension and whatever few bucks they'd managed to squirrel away. It was the Hawke and Keating Labor governments in the 1980s and 1990s that made these reforms, that gifted us the superannuation system that Australians enjoy today and a dignified retirement. Well, the previous government's record is consistent with every Liberal government before them. They've always hated superannuation. I've never really understood why they've hated it so much. They've never liked the idea of working Australians having a dignified retirement. At every stage, and the record shows this, through the Fraser government, or Fraser opposition, then Fraser government, through the Howard, Peacock, Howard oppositions, through the Howard government, through the Abbott, Turnbull, Morrison debacle, at every stage when they're in government, they try to freeze, nip, tuck and undermine superannuation. They started it in 1974 when the then Whitlam government launched an inquiry into introducing a universal super scheme for Australians, and they've opposed it ever since. But this time they've got something new. They've got a silly new scare campaign. You know, Deputy Speaker, it's a day ending in Y. The Liberal Party have a new silly scare campaign. The opposition are actually claiming that this bill will somehow end early access to superannuation for financial hardship or compassionate grounds. I mean, that is utter rubbish. The bill has no impact whatsoever on existing arrangements for early access for financial hardship or on compassionate grounds. Those arrangements are unchanged by this bill. So if they're going to oppose it, at least they could try telling the truth and being upfront and consistent about the fact that they just don't like superannuation and they don't like Australians having a dignified retirement. Now, in addition to that core, the fundamental point, there are numerous other benefits and outcomes of the superannuation system beyond just that dignified retirement, important as it is. Firstly, there's really important fiscal reasons that should be recognised, even by the Liberal Party, of giant debts and deficits. They're $1 trillion of Liberal debt with not enough to show for it, record deficits as far as the eye can see. It's a bit of a contrast with the government, isn't it? The first surplus in 15 years, something they never achieved. But if you look back in the 1980s, thereabouts, there was about 6 or 7 workers, 6 or 7 taxpayers for every retiree. That's how things worked in the country then, relatively young population. In the intervening decades, we're now down to around 4 taxpayers for every retiree, and the projections are Not long from now, we'll be down to 3 workers, just 3 workers, paying tax to support every retiree. That ratio doesn't add up for a high-quality country. Now, successive governments have smoothed that curve a little bit with skilled migration, but that's the reality of the trend. And what that means is more pressure on the pension system, for more pressure on the health system, more pressure on the aged care system, and frankly, either we run down, turn into a country of giant debt and degraded public services, or as Hawke and Keating showed, we put in place a system that provides for the dignified retirement of Australians and takes pressure off the budgets of future societies. It's now a right, not a privilege. And Australians often criticise governments for thinking too short-term. Well, it's difficult to think of a policy that was more long-term, more visionary, more beneficial to the long-term sustainability of our country and the retirement of working people than the introduction of universal superannuation. The second thing, though, it's not just fiscal sustainability, it's not just a dignified retirement, but we've also built up now an incredible national savings pool of nearly $3 trillion or thereabouts under management in this country. And that savings pool now reduces our reliance on foreign capital and foreign finance. It's projected to rise to nearly $10 trillion by 2040. That's an incredible national asset. It means that individual Australians, working Australians, will have a better retirement, but also they own more of our national wealth and what Australia produces. But this reduces Australia's reliance on foreign sources of finance. And as of about a decade ago, 2013-2014, we achieved an incredible milestone in this country because of our superannuation system. For the first time in our modern country's history, Australians owned more stuff overseas in other countries than foreign countries or investors owned in our country. That's a fantastic achievement that's only been made possible through the accumulation of the capital pool in superannuation. First time in our history. I mean, we're a capital-intensive country. We've always welcomed proper, productive foreign investment, not speculation on the housing market, but things that actually grow jobs, grow our national wealth and economy. But because of our superannuation system, we balance that out and we own stuff elsewhere. That gives Australians an enormous ability to diversify their investments, to bring profits back home from around the world, to enrich individual Australians and grow our collective national wealth, but also to hedge against economic shocks. And we can apply this productive savings, this national savings pool, to productive assets. The third thing I'd just note in passing, it lowers the cost of Australian borrowing and actually helps Australian governments maintain our AAA credit rating. The long-term positive fiscal effect on the federal budget actually boosts Australia's international fiscal credibility. Nerdy, niche, but true. When international ratings agencies, bond markets, international partners, when they size up countries and have a good hard look at you and decide, well, what's your credit rating going to be and how much should you pay, what's your risk rating, how much should you be paying on money that you borrow, what's your interest rate, they consider whether you've provided for your ageing population in your pension system. It's not rocket science. It's difficult for those opposite to understand because they always attack super, but most people could understand the point I've just made. In countries, and you have to look across much of Europe with ageing populations, countries get themselves into terrible fiscal trouble when they haven't put away superannuation with their unfunded pension entitlement system and an ageing population. That combination, Deputy Speaker, an ageing population, fewer taxpayers to support every retiree, is a fiscally toxic combination of higher debt and deficits. It's a bit like having a Liberal government, really. But rating agencies look at these things. Without Australia's super pool, we'd be far less likely to have and hold a AAA credit rating, and we'd be paying more as Australians. Every taxpayer would be paying more for the Liberal debt that they left. But why now? I mean, why introduce this objective now? Well, two key reasons. A few key reasons. More Australians are reaching retirement age right now than at any other time in our history, and better retirement incomes have never been more important. More Australians right now, Deputy Speaker, are now transitioning from the accumulation phase into the decumulation phase, the retirement phase of their super. And it's natural that any government, a sensible government, would wish to strengthen the superannuation system in light of this. But if you wrap all this up, Deputy Speaker, the battle lines for superannuation yet again, right here in this parliament, with this legislation, are drawn. Labor created superannuation. Labor defends the superannuation system. as being good for workers and good for everyday Australians in their retirement, but also good for the nation with that incredible over $3 trillion savings pool that we can use as a nation to invest in productive businesses and infrastructure here and overseas and reduce our reliance on foreign capital. Labor championed an increase in workers' pay through the legislated increase in superannuation. They were attacking and trying to get rid of, effectively trying to— now, you won't be shocked to hear this. You don't need to be sitting down to hear this, Deputy Speaker. Try to cut workers' pay, as they always do, and they did. Cutting penalty rates, not paying people pay rises, trying to cut superannuation. Now, there's another set of reasons why, of course, when you look at those opposite, why it's important that the government legislates an objective, a permanent, abiding objective for the superannuation system to provide for Australians a dignified retirement. And that's because constantly, when they're in government, well, now even they're trying it in opposition, they're always thinking up ways to trash and undermine and wreck the superannuation system. They did it in COVID. They effectively privatised the first stage of the COVID support, stimulus, recovery work, forcing Australians, vulnerable Australians, to raid their retirement savings for their own purposes, for the government's purposes, with a devastating impact on their retirement savings of millions of Australians. Around $38 billion of savings that were meant to last Australians a lifetime were drained out of super accounts in a matter of months. Around 1 million Australians were forced, when they were in government, to trash all of their superannuation, to raid all of their retirement savings, because the former government, this is a word that might freak them out, frankly, failed and refused to take the more effective option to socialise the risk by providing proper support to those in need. It was a really shameful exercise. They've still never apologised for it. They still never said sorry to the million Australians who were forced to draw down their precious and, in many cases, meagre small retirement savings to do the job that the then government should have done. But of course they're at it again, with possibly the dumbest housing policy you could dream up, with their super for housing policy that would raise the cost of housing. You don't make housing more affordable by making it more expensive. There's a tip for free. But that is their policy. It's a good illustration of why we need a legislated objective. So if you wanted to introduce something as stupid as their super for housing policy, you'd have to actually articulate in a statement of compliance what it would do to the dignified retirement of Australians. You'd actually be forced to have a look at that and not come up with things that are so silly. There's a reason, of course, why successive Prime Ministers, Abbott and Turnbull and even Morrison, until he freaked out a week before the last election and caved in, there's a reason why successive Prime Ministers rejected this, why successive finance ministers and housing ministers rejected this silly idea, because it would push up the cost of housing. So if you're a young couple, Deputy Speaker, going to an auction, if you and Michali, say some years ago, were going to an auction and trying to buy your first house, and you had your superannuation in your pocket, you're bidding up the cost of housing and trashing your retirement savings. I mean, it's a gold medal, isn't it, for policy stupidity, to achieve two such silly outcomes with one bad policy. Trash your retirement savings, push up the cost of housing. Who's the person who wins from this? The guy selling the house. You may as well just shovel the cash out of your super account into the pocket of the guy selling the house. It's a really bad policy. But to bring it back in closing to the bill, whenever they can, they'll be dreaming up new ways to trash and undermine the superannuation system, hurting the retirement prospects of everyday Australians, pushing up the cost of pensions with fewer and fewer taxpayers to pay them, pushing Australia further into more liberal debt, more liberal deficits, and potentially increasing the cost of capital, the cost of borrowing for the country when they run up their giant debt and deficits, because international ratings agencies would look at us and go, well, you haven't got a proper super system anymore. So I do commend the bill to the House. The primary objective of superannuation is to provide a dignified retirement for Australians, and that's a cause that we all should support.
I thank the